with that, we are going to move on to our afternoon panel. Very lucky to have all of the members of GMA 12 sitting here in front of us. Is that correct, all the members? Yep. Before we start the PowerPoint, I want to kind of lay out a little bit of a context on why it is that this is particularly significant. And Judith earlier asked a question about the differences in the DFC across an aquifer and how, why that is and what the impacts are. And I want you to know that this is a particularly relevant current discussion that's happening on a statewide policy level. The legislature entertained a number of bills that address this concept of uniformity, how it is that districts are managing or permitting in different ways, and how that's affecting groundwater management overall. There was a very strong conversation about that. One of the things that we talk about with groundwater districts is the benefit is that they're able to respond to local conditions, local needs, and local policy decisions, right? That's one of the huge benefits, and as we've already discussed, it's unique to Texas. And the way that the differences kind of operate is that you've got Chapter 36 of the Water Code that serves as a baseline under which they all have to operate. And then they use that as a toolbox, right, in determining how they respond to those local needs and conditions. So today's panel is to discuss that a little bit within a GMA and to do a comparison. They have done a phenomenal job of going ahead and starting that conversation of how can we compare rules and start to look at, okay, how are we different, how are we similar, and kind of what does that mean? So with that, let me introduce the panel and the members of GMA 12. We have all the way on the left-hand side, we have Alan Day from Brazos Valley GCD, David Van Dresser.
I want to say one thing. We're going to take ownership of all that drawdown that Gary has been experiencing over the years. We take ownership of that.
Thank you, Alan. And gentlemen, if I could ask you to turn on your mics at the bottom and share those. I know that that's going to be a logistical challenge.
Put it in the off position, break.
So continuing the introductions, we have David Van Dresser, who currently has the microphone from the Fayette Groundwater Conservation District. Of course, you all know Gary Westbrook of the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. Next, we have Jim Totten of Lost Pines. And finally, David Bailey of Mideast Texas GCD. So let's welcome our panelists, and we will start the conversation. So quickly, and Gary, you chime in if I'm missing anything, but very quickly, overview of the groundwater conservation districts in the state of Texas. There are 100 groundwater conservation districts and 2 subsidence districts, so 98 and 2. I'm always looking at Robert whenever I say that. And through the past session, we also have 1 additional groundwater conservation district whose enabling legislation passed, although they have not yet gone through local confirmation. And you see that little red parameter drawing out where we are. We've already gone over what the major and minor aquifers are, but the point here is to kind of look at the general shape of the Carrizo-Wilcox area and to reflect on that shape as you then look at the GMA structure. So if you were to combine GMA 11, 12, and 13, it would kind of form that same swath of one of the major aquifers, right? So just thinking about conceptually, as we have this discussion about political boundaries versus aquifer boundaries, the concept behind the design of the GMAs as Larry went through, was really to kind of holistically look at the aquifer. So GMA 12, you have, let's see if I can use this pointer, right here, are these gentlemen sitting here. And those include, again, Brazos Valley, Fayette County, Lost Pines, Mideast Texas, and Post Oak Savannah. So there you have them. That's nice touch here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through and talk kind of quickly about the comparison of their different rules and approaches, right? And part of the way that groundwater districts help regulate groundwater is through spacing of wells, production limits. I mean, there's a variety of different components of how it is that the rules individually address what their local needs and conditions are. So what we're going to do is start to run through these, and I'm going to ask the panelists to chime in if there's something in particular, if we see that there's a particular difference. So going across here, we see in terms of exempt wells, where that limit is or what it is that is determined as an exempt well. We've got 50,000 on the left-hand side with Allen. Fayette County is at 25, Lost Pines is at 25, Mideast Texas is at 50, and Post Oak is at 25. So gentlemen that are at 50, Mideast Texas and Brazos Valley, why 50 instead of 25?
Okay. Well, 50, my understanding, when the district was created, the 3 counties, Freestone, Leon, and Madison, predominantly agricultural, rural, not a lot of pumping in our district compared to the other, well, Alan, okay, I'll jump on Alan. In order to increase the number of exempt wells, the board of directors decided to double the limit from 25,000 to 50,000. So that was the reason.
From what I know, it's been on here, been 5 years, but the 50,000 came as if they wanted to be able to have domestic and livestock use, but also wanted if someone had a line of irrigation, had an orchard, had a little bit of area and they needed to irrigate, that didn't fall under a permitted well. And then we also, I'll comment on the fact that on our oil and gas, of course, rig supplies across the board were all exempt, but a couple of years ago, I guess it's been 3 years ago now, we decided that frac wells, we had a lot of activity going on, frac wells then became non-exempt. And I see that David and Gary have done the same thing. So I don't know if you may not have the activity that you need to, your board may not want to do that, huh, Doug?
No, frac supply with us is non-exempt, and it has been for about 3 years. Yeah.
So that's actually the very next slide, I believe, is whether frac wells require permits. So the only difference up here is Lost Pines. Jim, would you like to comment on that? Maybe, would you like to, is not the right phrasing. Would you comment on it?
We did have some frac activity back in the last couple of years, same as everybody else did. But at that point in time, I think prior to that, I don't think the board had really considered the need to permit frac wells. And then at the time that we had the most recent wave of fracking kind of come through, we were tied up, I would say, on bigger issues, handling some larger permits. So we just didn't feel like taking that fight at that point in time. It's definitely something that's on our radar, but at this point in time, it's just not something we're taking up.
Thank you. Lost Pines is a district that was involved in a very long lawsuit, 7 years?
It was one $15 million lawsuit, a 2.5-year contested case, and then another 2-year contested case after that.
So you had a couple of things to handle.
So yeah, we had a few other things that we were dealing with.
Great. So one of the discussions that we had a lot during the legislature and some of the proposed bills was the permitting approach that districts use. And Chapter 36 allows for a variety of approaches, and some of those include historic use or existing use permits. Some of those include correlative rights, and correlative rights means that you would have a permit based on the amount of acreage used, so the amount would be correlated to a certain amount of acreage ownership. Sometimes it's a hybrid approach. Sometimes there's a couple of different varieties here. So in terms of permits by production and acreage, it looks like Lost Pines again is the only one that doesn't have that. Any further comments or kind of similar deal?
And then you're going to hear this phrase a lot, I think. Gary may be the only one that can't actually use it, but my understanding, I wasn't here at the time that those rules were set up, but my understanding is at the time that the district set up its production rules and its permitting rules, they felt that, basically on a per acre basis, a sustainable yield would have been well below the 2 feet or the 3 feet, would have been more on the order of acre inches. And so combining that with presence of a lot of rural water supplies, that would have driven them, rural water supplies, to have to lease more or less the entire county to be able to meet their existing permitted demands. So the district at that time felt it would be an undue burden on rural water supplies and municipalities to go to a correlative right system, at least on a conservative number, using acre inches per acre per surface acre.
Great, thank you. I think that brings up a really valuable point again about looking at the GCDs being able to respond to local needs and conditions. For example, in this discussion about correlative rights versus existing use, If you look at the Ogallala, which is more of a homogeneous aquifer, and the use is more homogeneous as well, a correlative right structure up there maybe makes better sense than having it in an area where there's growing municipalities and where acreage ownership is not as large and uniform, right? And so there's some, right here just in GMA 12, within the same aquifer, you can already see some of the diversity in terms of the way that they were responding to what the permitting approach should be. So here's just a layout of how it is that that production is assigned. Alan, do you want to comment on it?
Okay, so you look at across the board, and you got David Van Dresser over here at 2 acre-feet per acre. Mid-East Texas at 3. You have Post Oak, Savannah at 2. So 100 acres, or if you need 200 acre-feet of water, you got to have 100 acres of owner-controlled water rights. Ours says it varies based upon AAGPM. That is average annual gallons per minute. Not yet. We're not to the next slide yet. An average annual gallons per minute is simply, they come into my office and they say, the first question I ask is, how much water do you want to produce? And they give me a number. And then I take and I have a formula that we use, which is based on at what rate will it take to produce the amount of water that you're wanting to produce, pumping the well 24/7, 365. So we multiply the number by 0.62. That annualizes the production, which is the same method that you use in the groundwater modeling to measure the impact of a well in the model. It's a scientifically based method of saying, what is the impact of that well on the aquifer in 1 year, annualized, not instantaneous, but what happens over a year. So if you go to the next slide, so if you can see the red circle there, that's a Simsboro well. Someone has come in and asked for 200 acre-feet of water a year. We've multiplied the 200 times 0.62, and it's a radius of 124 feet from the well bore. We draw a circle around that well bore. It requires 1.11 acres to get 200 acre-feet, but you've got to own and control that circle. You've got to control the water rights under that circle. And you notice that it's within that same parcel. You see the parcel lines? So this is a one owner. Don't have to worry about it. He's going to show us that he has water rights. Go to the next slide, please. Now you see that it's moved. He's moved his well. He wants it in behind the pond. And now you see that it has overlapped into 2 others. In order to do that, they're going to have to show, I have control of it on my property, and I've brought in a piece of paper that says, these 2 other landowners have given me the right to pump water. He can go on his merry way at that point, okay? Next slide, please. All right, there's that same tract, but they want Sparta water, or they want a minor aquifer, okay? Well, we treat that a little differently. We space it at 2 feet per foot per average annual gallons per minute rather than 1. So I just maximize the amount of water that could be taken in a minor aquifer off that tract. It ended up being 441 acre feet with a radius of 547 feet. It required 21.57 acres underneath that to be able to pump that. And I know there are people who are going to say, my goodness gracious, that's a lot of water. I want to go back to something that was said earlier. We have an enforcement rule for our DFCs. We manage through our DFCs. We measure these wells. We know what the impacts are, and we actually went into the Post Oak Savannah rule book and we saw their template for their DFC enforcement, and we patterned ours after that. We think we made ours a little better, but we have the same triggering mechanisms. We know that we can stop the pumping. We know that when it comes time that we're approaching those triggering levels, that there are things that we can implement to slow the pumping down, and once we get there, we know we can make the haircuts and we can still allow people to come in and pump. I'm gonna pass the microphone.
Well, maybe just showing the reverse of the last slide and talking about permitting structures. The Lost Pines obviously has chosen to use a beneficial use model, which Jim already commented on, unless there's anything further to comment on. DFC enforcement rules. Alan, you started to alluding to that. David or Gary, do y'all want to comment a little bit about some of the differences you see here? So Brazos Valley has already alluded to it, maybe Gary?
You know, I think the answer there to all of them is yes. We all have rules in place. A couple of us are very similar. Alan already mentioned that. And, you know, this is, by the way, this is the third meeting of the general managers in GMA 12. We chose to have this one in this forum so that it would be public. The other two have been public as well, but they've been, you know, immediately following a GMA 12 meeting, and those are not as well attended. But we wanted everybody to know that we do communicate, we do work together, and I mean, these guys are like brothers to me in every way. I mean, we even squabble and fight sometimes, but very much a fraternity, if you will. When you're one of the GMAs, it's really closely looked at in the state. But I think all of us are moving toward a similar approach to enforce those DFCs. We've all compared notes, and we've seen some things that we like, and you know, over the next few years, I think you'll see some similarities develop in a lot of our rules. Is that a fair? Anybody out on that one? Or, okay.
I'll say this on our triggering. Our first trigger level is at 65% of the DFC on the average basis across. Our second trigger level, and there are certain things we can do it down on them by choice of the board. Our next is 80%, and there's more. Those are not mandatory curtailment, but there are things. Management zones can be implemented. Different things can go on. When we get to 90%, we never make it to 100% of the DFC. We stop at 90. When it's triggered at 90, we're done. That's where we're going to implement curtailment or stop sustainable pumping, and then begin to make the haircuts as needed.
So you said that you've got a tiered approach to how it is that you enforce on the DFC based on statistically where you are in reaching your DFC.
Absolutely, and I think everybody knows. Gary has preached this for years. Folks from Savannah has preached it for years. It's in the book. There's no. It's not hidden. It's there. Everybody can read it. They are aware of what's going on and how it's going to happen. So I think that's an important thing for Saul to move towards. Is there's no ambiguity. There is certainty in what we do.
Yeah, and I think one of the things for us on a local level, we had some quite a few people express concern about our threshold level and requested that we revisit those. And so actually this spring, we actually you quoted those threshold levels, which used to be the same as ours, and then he said that theirs was better. But our 65%, we dropped it to 50. So we're going to hit our earlier threshold and begin to take those strategies into account a little earlier than previously we had considered. We also moved the other two thresholds to a little bit more conservative level as well. And I know Toya talked about that this morning in her part of that panel. But I think we're all moving that way.
David, because earlier we talked about some of maybe the increased pumping that we're seeing in Fayette, how is it that you're addressing the enforcement of the DFC and curtailments?
Well, on that, I think what you need to look at as well is size and population and the amount of actual production that is occurring at any given in any given district. As far as GMA 12 goes, Fayette County, half of my district is in GMA 12, which is half of my county. The population of my county is 25,000 people, so 12,000 people live in GMA 12. The production numbers in Fayette County are very low. DFC enforcement, or DFC, when we look at our DFCs and our and drawdowns and these kind of things, especially in the Carrizo or the Sparta or the Queen City, it's outside the district lines in our neighboring districts that would more affect what we're doing, as opposed to what's inside my own district and occurring there having any effect on anyone else. So we're constantly watching that. Jim and I, we share the same geologists, so that helps us quite a bit because they're watching for both of us. Lost Pines is the only sister district in this GMA that we touch. So we're constantly watching each other and making sure. As far as DFC enforcement in my district, in monitoring how that DFC is going to work over time, triggering aspects of that may not be within our control over a sister district's control. So we have to, when we see a problem occurring at a specific location or within a specific region or area within the district, that's where we can go in and start curtailing or amending permits from our permitted users that way. It's easier for us to maintain it that way. Because if we try and hit trigger points and we have no control over that, I could take all of my permitted users down to nothing and we would still be losing water. So you have to look at where we're sitting in the GMA and our production values individually.
And David, I think you bring up another really great point, that even though within GMA 12, the districts, you also have counties without GCDs, right? And so there are several scenarios around the state where you have neighboring counties that do not have a GCD, therefore they do not have a DFC or a seat at the GMA table. And it may be that their pumping affects the decisions that the members of the GMA are making negatively, right? And so there's this kind of this interesting side conversation happening about, well, what happens to those unmanaged areas?
Well, Williamson County is one that Jim and I both kind of keep an eye on because we got a pretty good sized project right in the corner.
Right, and Clearwater as well. And we've got the general manager here from Clearwater as well. So that's kind of an interesting topic to bring up as well. We've already gone over this. All of y'all manage your permits based to the DFC rather than to the MAC, so that's something that you have in common. And that topic was brought up earlier when Larry spoke, where they said, okay, well, once the MAG is set, and you see where the production permits are, the paper permits, the permitted amount, if it goes over the MAG, well, is that an issue? Well, no, because actually statutorily, GCDs are required to manage to the DFC over a planning horizon because of some of the variability that Robert spoke to earlier. So GM permitted wells. Some districts have rules in place that allow GMs to automatically approve a permit up to a certain amount. And basically this is just administrative efficiency, right? And so there's a comparison here of where the various general managers have their authorization up to. And this would be something that would be set by the board.
Also, but we have sheets out there with all this on there. Some of y'all picked them up on the way in. You might want to take notes or grab them on the way out just to save you a little time, but all of that's on a sheet out there on the table. So.
Perfect, thank you. Another interesting comparison that y'all put together is what the term lengths are for the permits. Again, another very important discussion that happened at the legislature this year was about regulatory certainty. So as people apply for permits, particularly as we're moving into a more formalized groundwater market, how it is that those permit lengths are determined. And so if you see a comparison here, all of them have at a minimum 5 year. What's the 1 year, Brazos Valley? 1 year and 5 year?
Those are our GM issued permits, 150 acre feet or less.
I see, okay.
Or 1 year permits, renewable. I'm interested though, I love Gary's. He's got a 1 year or a 40 year.
Why didn't one point it out that way? There's obviously some sort of a battle going. So Gary.
So that goes to the oil and gas. One of the things that we're always catching grief at the legislature about, the oil and gas folks will come in there and say, man, we can't go through this hearing process. We can't go through all the, we got to have our water now. We need to drill when the timing is right. So in response to that, we made it to where I could issue those permits if they could prove up that they had those water rights, but that permit was only good for 1 year and one use. It's good for a year, and once you've used that permit to frack that well, you go back to zero and you got to start over. And so that's why you have a 1 year in there. The 40 year has 5 year reviews. It's a 40 year permit, but it has 5 year reviews built in, which is kind of like a 5 year that's automatically renewed, nothing changes. So
which is
we're
required.
really all pretty similar there, yeah.
Right, and the automatic renewal process, which is administrative efficiency, is part of a bill that passed the last legislative session that's required of GCDs anyway. I'm going to go through the rest of these comparisons in the next 5 minutes so that we can get to the last part of the discussion. So, renewals, we just went through that. So the first four, other than post-oak, they all just, the renewals happen for the length of the permit term, and then Gary just explained how it is that the review process every 5 years occurs. Does this mean that all of you have export permit requirements? Yes, the XSD, they do have export permit requirements, which is a separate permit to a regular operating permit, correct?
Ours might be folded in. We've never had an export permit, but it's likely that we would probably fold it into our operating permit.
So some discussion about, again, administrative efficiency and folding in, having a separate export permit with a operating permit doesn't change the way that they're reviewed, but it simply is a reflection of some of the current dialogue on it. The fee structure for permits is in Brazos Valley based on metered production, in Fayette County is tax-based, and for the other three, permitted production. And if you have questions on that, we'll get back to it. Are there meters required for permitted wells? Yes, and this is a big deal. This is not always politically palatable to everybody in Texas. So this is a good deal and improves their science, their metering, and their accuracy. Okay. The requirements of hydrologic studies for permits, I'm assuming. Tell me about this. Lost Pines, is there not a requirement there for the same reason?
I don't actually recall how we came to that. Plus, we do require a 36-hour pump test
Okay.
to be submitted with any non-exempt well application. So that would be, I guess, the hydrologic study plus modeling is carried out by the district's consultants.
Great, thank you. The frequency of monitoring wells, and I was so pleased that a member of the audience earlier came up asking how it is that he could volunteer his unused well to add to the post-oak monitoring well network, which is just fabulous and huge. So the frequency of the monitoring wells that they take measurements would be quarterly for Brazos Valley, annually for Fayette, annually and continuously for Lost Pines, annually for Mideast, Texas, and then annually and continuously for post-oak. So that's just the frequency by which their field techs probably go out and take water level measurements.
And if
and
you're using a
monitoring wells.
transducer that stays in the well all the time, you get the continuous.
That's right. So for the continuous ones, it means that you have automatic measurements that are electronically populating.
Sarah, I'd like to add too, on our monitoring wells, and those of you who come to GMA meetings, you know that Brazos Valley, others I believe are making concerted effort to start looking at some of those shallow wells, those unconfined wells. We've got two aquifers that are truly important in that area right now, Simsboro and Hoover. We're developing a serious grid of those. We're having to go off up into Falls and to some of Limestone County to find some of those wells, which are going to be advantageous even today because those are going to be wells that overlap and that we can use. I think it's really important that we all share our monitoring data across. This is a regional thing, and everybody impacts everybody else. I know we impact more than anybody else, I know. But wait till you get your Vista Ridge project on you. Wait till that comes.
Alan. So spacing, and there's a number of slides here that talk about the different spacing for the variety of aquifers. Rather than try to walk through each of these, unless there's a particular comment that you want to make, the importance here is that spacing is one of the ways in which groundwater districts help to protect the landowners and the aquifer by setting reasonable spacing requirements for how far away a well has to be from a property boundary and from its neighboring well. And the purpose of this, if you remember earlier that really important hydrogeology 101 about the cone of depression, is to make sure that you're not forming cones of depression and negatively impacting your neighbors, correct? So you see here that there's, these are collected the way that they treat the spacing in Simsboro, in Calvert Bluff, in the Carrizo Aquifer, Queen City Aquifer, Sparta Aquifer. How do you
Can
say
we
that?
talk about the AWA just for a second? So the AWA, when we were seeing a lot of frac going on here a couple of years ago, we began to realize that a horizontal spacing was good, but we were also going to have to add another buffer. So we also added a spacing based on depth, and so now within 2,500 feet of another well, you've got to be 200 feet lower than the screens of any other well. And that's because that aquifer has a lot of clay lenses in it, which buffer water moving top to bottom. But that's another one of those evaluations that was done after hydrologic study, and that seemed to resolve some of the issues that we had. But we've got two separate types of setbacks here. You've got a setback from the property line, and you've got a setback from the closest well in the same formation, and I think all of us deal with that.
And Dave Bailey, would it be accurate for me to say that, you know, in looking at the differences in the way that you're treating spacing, if there are any differences, is it simply because of the track sizes and the differences of use? I mean, what would you say account for some of the differences between your spacing treatments and the different aquifers between the districts? Does that make sense? Is that too abstract of a question?
Is David?
Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's two of us. Well, I think it's important to have spacing between the wells. Ours is for any exempt well, it's 50 feet from the nearest property line or a well in the same aquifer. And then as you get into more larger productions, as I think we all have, the more you look at that spacing from wells, more particularly in the same zone. Yes, it's important.
So it's a reflection really of the use and location and kind of what's going on, and okay, good deal. So now we're going to go on in the last 15 minutes, and I want to make sure and save time for questions, because I'm sure that you all have questions, is talking a little bit about some of the more abstract treatments. So remember when Larry went through the 9 considerations in determining a DFC, and he grouped those last 4, I think, out of the 9 as saying, well, those are more of the policy kind of considerations. So the first are all data, so you're quantitative. And then there's some policy considerations as well. So those are going to be the last discussion, and this I think is where it gets really interesting. How do you verify your property rights? So if somebody comes and asks for a well, how do you verify that they have the property right to apply for that well?
You may start.
Sure, Alan.
Somebody comes in from an exempt well, we pull up our map, they give us a name, we pull up the Brazos or Robertson County Appraisal District map, we click on it if it's got their name, we make an assumption that they own the water rights under the tract at that point, but they also sign on there that everything is true and good. Okay? When oil and gas comes in, bring me your lease, show me that it says the 2 places on the producer's 88, or bring me a water use agreement. If somebody comes in and they've just bought a tract of land and they need a production well, they see the warranty deed. We have just gone through this process where we're probably now, we've gone to Gary and asked for they have an affidavit that says we have the authority to pump the water from under this. We've shown that to you. It puts the monkey on their back, takes the monkey off of the general manager, making that legal decision. So that's, we're this close to having the affidavit in place, but you've got to show that you control the water rights.
I got you. Do any of you do it differently than that? You know, something that we discussed at the last Groundwater Summit in San Marcos was as there's more and more demand on groundwater and as that market is formalizing, there's a lot of severance of the mineral estate, right? Severance of the groundwater rights and subdivisions, further subdivisions of tracts of land. So as all of that is happening, to what degree is the appraisal district keeping up with all of the titles and how are they communicating to groundwater districts? So that's something I think that's kind of something to look to in the future on how to better coordinate the communication between the two.
And that started here in our 2 counties as far back as 1997. So 20 years ago, folks were buying property with the intent of simply stripping the water rights away by deed, filing it at the courthouse, and reselling the surface acreage. That's 5 years before the district. And we've seen that so many times, so we actually, like Alan said, we have a place on the application, whether it's exempt or permitted, where you have to check that you do own those property rights, and if you don't, you have to go get permission from whoever does. And that is something that gets a little sticky sometimes.
We're beginning to see things come in the door that say we've retained a small part of the ownership. 20%, whatever, more like an oil and gas. So, our question was, if they only own 20, do they have the right to pump the water? Well, co-tenancy says they can. And they can pump it all, as long as they, under co-tenancy. So we're kind of having to deal with that.
And there's a lot of discussion right now about that severance, about the mineral state. Most recently, a case law decision that held an accommodation doctrine, which is taken from oil and gas principles, that they're dealing with kind of really quickly evolving and interesting concepts here in terms of the property rights and verifying that when determining a permit.
I want to say one more thing.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't matter who comes in the door. It doesn't matter if it's a municipality, a rural water supply, a irrigator, farmer. It doesn't matter. They're going to have to show us that they own and control it. I think we're somewhat different than anybody else in that regard. Because I don't know how everybody else handles public water supplies, but everybody's got to show they own and control.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to move on to the standardized classification of wells. I want to ask you, what does that mean?
So-
how are different districts handling it? And Gary, what's your concern with it?
Yeah, this is kind of what I asked to add in here, and nobody vetoed it, so I appreciate that. But across our GMA, we all use the same model. It's getting improved, and within that model, you have the different wells, and based on the depth of their screens, they're classified in a specific aquifer or formation. Well, we actually have found some wells that even though they may be classified in one, they actually respond more like the adjacent formation. As an example, the Gauls well, and I know Alan and I, by the way, we work very closely with each other. Alan gets some data from us, we get some data from Alan, and vice versa all the way across. But that well, even though it responds like a Sinsboro well, when you look at how it responds to production, it's actually classified in the Calvert Bluff. So when we're looking at our DFC enforcement, are we going to classify it Calvert Bluff, or are we going to classify it Sinsboro? Because if you guys classify it Sinsboro and we classify it Calvert Bluff, that's not going to work. And so this is something that we are all going to have to sit down over the next several years and really work on. Fortunately, that's not the issue with the lion's share of the wells we deal with. But we do know of probably, out of our 120 wells, there's probably a dozen of them that are classified differently than we believe they should be classified. And so on a one-by-one basis, we present our case to the Water Development Board. They agree or disagree, and we make those corrections. But across our GMA, that's something we've got to sit down and make sure we're all reading these things and using them the same way. So that's my
And correct me if I'm wrong, the purpose of y'all engaging, I mean, you took it upon yourself to do this comparison, right, of your rules. And the purpose of it is not just to see where you're different, but also to work towards having more similar. Alan, yes, you did the work. And that's a big deal for y'all to have done that. So going on to the monitoring protocol, as we've already heard, these districts have got monitoring well networks in place where they measure the water levels. We talked a little bit about that earlier, what that is and why it's significant. How are districts measuring those levels? And specifically, tell us how you're doing it, and tell us if you have any protocols in place about how you do it. We saw earlier that you're doing it annually or continuously. Anything else that you want to add about monitoring wells?
So Alan recently actually adopted some formal protocols that describe how they are going to monitor. Now, we have great staff with a lot of experience. Bobby, the hydrologist, been doing water level measurements for 5 years before he came to us, and he was doing it for the federal government. We've been trained personally. I have been trained when I was doing it by the Texas Water Development Board. We feel really good about what we do. However, Alan has actually adopted a formal protocol that's very extensive and very well defined, and we're looking at moving towards something similar to that, if not the exact same thing.
The reason that we did is that we adopted a DFC enforcement rule. And the second that we adopted that rule, the MDs in our district said, if you are going to curtail us, then the data that you get better be right. And it better not, better not be measuring a well that's in recovery And you gotta know whether it's in recovery or not. So when we go to a well, whether it's an E-line or we use steel tape, we've got to measure twice. We measure, and then we wait 5 minutes, and we measure again. And we got to make sure that on a steel tape, it's got to be within 200ths of a foot, and on an E-line, it's got to be within 500. And if it exceeds that, we walk away from the well, and we come another time, because we deem that being in recovery. It's beyond, that's how tight we look at that. We have standard protocol for the pressure transducers, for our airlines, everything is done. We have to have our own gauges. There are certified gauges, and when we go to airline, we use our gauges. Those things have to be certified once a year. We keep 3 always in service. It made sense when they made the statement, we want to make sure your data is right. It just makes all the sense in the world. So I guess there was some pushback at first. I think Megan is fine with it. She does most of the measuring out here. We're good with this. It makes sense for us.
May I ask just a real question going down the line? How many staff in each GCD? And I'll get to my point in a second. Alan? How many staff,
I have 3 staff total.
including yourself?
Me, Megan, my education coordinator, field tech, all around field person, and my wonderful office manager.
Okay, so Alan's 3, David?
2.
2, Gary?
4 plus a part-time.
4 plus, okay, Jim?
3.
3, David?
You're looking at
All right, and here's,
Because Alan's going over and measure, so he's got field tech.
well, here's my point about that. Checking and monitoring wells is a really manually intensive job, and I don't know if you're, you guys are obviously familiar with rural Texas. There's gonna be some long drives out to some really remote areas without signal. It takes a lot of time. So when you're talking about an annual process, I mean, this could be several weeks of checking all of your wells and, making sure. So depending on how many staff you have, that can be an easier or a harder process at any given time. So I just wanted to highlight that as a difference and bring that up. Anything else on standardized monitoring protocol before we move on? Great. So shallow zone water level limits. Gary, tell us about the classification of shallow zone wells. Why do you do it? What are they? And then panelists, what do you do if you're not doing it in a similar way?
So in 2005, that was when we developed what we call our shallow management zones. We took all these aquifers, you guys have seen so many cross-section, and we picked an area that we were going to call the shallow zone based on some assumptions. We've recently refined that to that 400 feet or less that you heard about earlier. But the whole purpose of that was that we knew those were the areas of the aquifer that were most susceptible to where folks would see a change in the availability of water in their wells. And so we wanted to adopt restrictions in those areas for water level changes. Just use the Simsboro, you saw that 300-foot DFC, that's for that whole aquifer. In that shallow zone, our restriction is 20 feet average across the whole district. So that's what we're trying to manage to there in the shallow. Now, for a long time, we're the lone ranger in that, but I know Alan has done a lot of work, and Jim has been talking about developing additional wells in those shallow areas. In fact, he and I had a conversation just last week about them picking up some of the wells that we had and had gotten from Alcoa when they quit producing and quit monitoring. And we're going to share that data, and hopefully before long our whole GMA will take advantage of something similar to that.
Do you have any further comments about that? And Jim?
Well, and I know Steve will like to hear this, but part of the other advantage to looking at that shallow zone is that's where you're going to see most of your surface water, groundwater interactions. And so by trying to monitor and protect that shallow zone, you're going to have more protection of springs and other surface
And endangered species, yeah.
So in addition to being more vulnerable in terms of landowners, it gives that secondary advantage of also looking at surface water interactions.
Okay, thank you.
I want to ask Alan to comment just real quick. He and I have had this discussion several times. You guys have picked up all these shallow monitor wells, and what kind of water level change have you seen in those shallowest of wells from readings that are 20, 30 years old?
I can say a lot of them, we don't have any historic data on, but I know the ones that we have started in on in Hoover have actually come up. That's where the groundwater model's wrong. Thank goodness for, but we have some, it's going to be really interesting because we're going to try to pick up those wells I was telling David and you guys earlier up in Limestone Falls, and they're hand-dug wells. And the last time the Water Development Board touched them was back in 1949. It's going to be interesting to see if any of those wells still have water in them. I think they will, but there are some wells out in there that were semi-floor wells in Robertson County that were dug 40 feet deep, and there is no water there now. So it's going to be interesting as we develop that.
David, did you have a comment?
Well, no. That's, and on some of those, and I agree with these guys, and that's great. In my county, everything is shallow zone because I don't have any water to speak of there anyway. Because it's all basically 500 feet and less. That's where all of my wells are sitting. So I'm always monitoring the shallow zone. But when we talk about the wells that are less than 50 feet, especially in the hodgepodge of aquifers that I have 7 aquifers in my county. Most of them outcrop there. I don't have, I have to monitor all of those. Then you start looking at, do we have perched lenses, these kind of things. We have to make sure when we're looking at these things to verify that we are dealing with an associated aquifer with it instead of a perch system. That's where I have some problems in trying to monitor a zone like that in my area. Because yes, we have some 30-foot deep wells in the septic tank zone. How many people have a septic tank zone wrong? I'm sorry. Yeah. But it's hard to tell, are we associating ourselves with an aquifer system, or if it's just a perch kind of thing. That's what we're doing.
Thank you. Any other comments? So, at this time, I wanted to make sure to leave at least 9 minutes exactly for questions from the audience. And those questions, I think, would be best suited if they address things like, why are you doing it differently, right? I mean, because that's really the purpose of this panel, is to show the groundwater districts that are in this GMA and the decisions that they are having to go through together. And so, that GMA process where they're setting the DFC, these guys work really hard at that. It is a continual process every 5 years, for the past few times, and they're constantly involved in it. So if you've got questions about that, this is a great opportunity for them to reflect on why it is that they make similar decisions or dissimilar decisions, and how it is they're going to be working towards making more similar decisions. Are there any, or did we just confuse everybody, or is everybody going into a post-lunch coma? Yes, I saw. Any questions or comments or anything that somebody would like to bring up? So the question was, as a homeowner, how difficult is it to get a permit to have a well? And I'll let you answer that.
So one of the things that we talk about in office all the time is making sure we're talking about the same thing. If you're a homeowner and you're going to use that well to produce water for livestock or domestic use, which is your homeowner's use, and you fall below the volume, well, then you're exempt from permitting. And so for us, you come in, you fill out the paperwork, and usually within 20 minutes you walk out the door with your paperwork to go give your driller so he can drill your well. If you actually do need a permit, if you're higher than the 17 and a half gallons a minute, in other words, more than the state law says incapable of 25,000 gallons a day. So that breaks down to 17 point something gallons. But anyway, but that's our process. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
And I'll add, what we do is, of course, we're at 50 like Dave is, so I say 35 gallons a minute or less. But once the well is drilled and once we get the well log, then we go to the well, we take a picture of the well, we geotag the well within 2 feet of its position on the face of the earth, and that goes in your file, and that goes in our database. And so if we ever have a nuclear attack and it wipes it out, we can go back and say, there's a hole right there.
Thank you. So So it's important to again, make sure that everybody understands the difference between a production permit, which is for above that 25,000, or just a registered well. And you're like, okay, well, if I'm exempt and I just have to register, why is it important to go through the 20 minutes of paperwork? Well, it's important because it adds to the knowledge, the quality of the data that the groundwater districts have on where the wells are, so that as they're making decisions about the DSCs, they know where the usage is, right? So that's the reason why it's important that you still be registered, even if you don't require an actual production permit.
Well, and
But
spacing too. If your
And
neighbor
spacing,
wants
that's
to
right.
put a well,
Exactly.
yeah, a bigger well in there from your neighbor, he's gotta be a certain distance away from you, so he doesn't affect you in a negative way, and so that spacing is so very important.
And in turn, I might add that if there were a permit that maybe you as a neighbor were unhappy with, if you were not registered, it wouldn't give you very good standing in terms of having a discussion about the impacts on your well. So I definitely, I think that in Texas there's always an interesting discussion about monitoring, having metering and registration, the rest of it, but in this case, it really is to your benefit to have your well registered. And there's a number of resources in terms of making sure that the water quality is good. How many of you have water quality offerings? Any of you? Gary does? And Alan, no? Well, they can at least, so some districts across the state allow you to bring in water samples, and Post Oak does, where you can look at some basic water quality parameters and say, hey, is there suddenly a dead rat in your well that you need to take care of, right? And so there are a number of things, not just about the volume, but also the quality of the water, and also these are the guys that make sure that your water well drillers are completing your well properly to ensure that you're not contaminating the aquifer, because those are direct conduits down into the aquifer, right? So there's a number of factors there of why it is important to interface with the groundwater district from the permitting and registration perspective.
I will let everybody know, in this particular GMA, you have mineralized water, okay? There's going to be some form of mineralization to your water no matter what. That's just the nature of the aquifer systems.
David is our official appointed member to the Texas Groundwater Protection Committee that puts out an annual report on water quality, and so he's very well informed on the patterns and happenings of water quality across the state. And he does a very good job, that's right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I got a question about, if you want to go into the subject about the frac, are we using fresh water to frac the well? Why are we requiring them to go down to brackish water to that?
Good question.
They have a lease, and the lease says we have free use of the water. We recognize every one of those aquifers as the landowner's aquifers. They get to make their choice. We don't make them, it's not our job to make those choices for them. We would love for them to go down and get brackish water. Absolutely. But I will say this. The amount of water used for frac water as it compares to irrigation or any other uses is a very small amount. It does come quickly at times. Most folks experience there's a lot of water going around. I get that. But that goes back to also, you got to make sure those wells are registered. Everybody wanted to be off the radar when we were formed. If I don't know where that well is and I have a high capacity well, I'll go in right over there. I can't separate them from that. If they'll let me know that I'm there, I can ask them to, we're going to move that over. We're going to impact over here. And they've been more than willing to move the wells and put them in places. Oil and gas companies don't want those headaches or the liabilities of drying somebody or pumping it down to where they're burning wells up. So, anyway, I'll put that plug in.
I think that there's two other things that I would add to that. First of all, there's a portion of Chapter 36 of the Water Code that has exemptions listed, and the oil and gas industry in Texas has worked very hard to make sure that they are a part of that chapter. There's some interpretation differences about what exactly that means, but that's an ongoing discussion. And the second thing I would add is that there's a really active effort right now, and in fact a bill filed this past session that was vetoed, unfortunately, House Bill 2377, that would actually lay out the groundwork for how it is that a groundwater district would issue a permit for brackish water in a brackish water production zone, which is an effort by the Texas Water Development Board. So I think the state overall is moving in a direction of having a more formal structure for those permits, specifically for brackish water out of production zones.
And there are some groundwater districts in Texas that do offer
Yes.
an incentive for those guys to go a little deeper and get that brackish. I think it's Pecan Valley, they're 2 acre feet per acre per year, but if you go get brackish water, they'll give you 3 or 3.5 or something like that. And you know, at some point in the future, when we get a little further down the road in these DFCs and we see some impacts that we want to manage in different ways, maybe that's one of the ways that we address that. But today, people don't maybe sometimes realize how young we are in establishing just what property rights and groundwater really mean. There's still court cases that are to be decided. That'll have a lot to say about that. But when I'm going to start telling you, you know what, you can use your water, but you can't use it for this or for that, I'm on some pretty thin ice there. And so, yeah, if we can incentivize it, that's one way. But just saying no, you can't use
Well,
it.
this makes sense, not waste, but
I
like you
agree.
said, it's just reminding you how water.
I agree. Yeah, you don't want to waste the good stuff when they could be using the bad stuff.
So
But
they're shut down the same place anyway.
yeah, but those are the, that's the balance. The last 2 hours you've heard nothing but balance. What, Bobby?
As a hydrologist, I'll also add that there really isn't a whole lot of brackish water per se at the shallow formations here in Burleson and Milam counties.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of brackish in our area anyway, so.
And you know
I don't have any.
what's interesting in terms of looking at the individual rules, again, reflecting on how it is that Chapter 36 is a toolbox that they can kind of adjust as necessary, not adjust the toolbox, but use it to meet local needs, and that's right, is, for example, this effort with this tax bill and brackish water production, they can go ahead and amend their rules to start doing that. You don't have to have the legislation, you have to do it if the legislation goes through, but they can already, but they can take the incentive, they can already, go ahead and do it. And so what's interesting about this process of them comparing their rules is they are proactively saying, okay, there's some differences. Okay, well, are those differences justified? Are they reasonable? Do they respond to a local need and condition? But if they don't, and there's a way to make them more similar, they're proactively already addressing that process, which is really, I think, ahead of the curve in terms of the policy discussion.
Right, and I think one of the things that we stress all the time, or at least I do when I go to the legislature, is even though us 5 manage a shared resource, we have different issues within our own districts. Allen's got such a large population area, we don't. GMA has one county that does and one that doesn't. And so the ways that we deal with some of those issues is a little different. The way we treat our local water utilities is way different than our neighbors do because we can. We kind of exempted them from having the extra acreage because it was such a small amount of water when you totaled it all up. But if he did that with Bryan and College Station, boy, that would blow everything way out of the water. And so we've all got different issues that we're trying to address, and we're trying to be as similar as we can when it makes good sense. But at the same time, we're trying to do that so that we are allowed to continue to manage individually as a group. Does that make sense?
And the benefit to you is that because they're doing it in that way, each portion of the GMA has each of their local populations, which means that you guys can still interact with them as the public and have your input, right? And so it really creates a very democratized system of looking at the resource overall, which is my major plug for Texas Groundwater Management. Are there any final questions? We are coming to the end of the time allotted for this. Yes, ma'am. That is a fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked it. The question was, if you have an old well on your property that is caved in or is deteriorated or abandoned, what do you do with it? Do you still want it? It's an abandoned, you absolutely, first of all, want to get it plugged, probably. And I think that probably David from TGPC, you want to...
We didn't talk about that. So we have a plugging program. We pay all the costs up to $2,500, 100% of the cost. Just get with us and fill out the paperwork, and we'll enter into a contract with a qualified individual, and they'll plug it for you. I don't know if anybody else does something similar.
So what they're doing is they're comparing the variety of programs that they have available to assist you. So it's actually Legally, it is the landowner's responsibility to plug that well if it is abandoned or deteriorated. I'm sorry?
You cannot produce water from a deteriorated well. It must be plugged by state law.
That's right.
Now, if it's a hand-dug well, you can do it on your own. There's a guide to doing that. But if it's a drilled well, you must have a well driller do it for you. Okay? Because there's certain criteria that they have to follow in the state law to make that happen. But if you have a well that is falling apart and it's not usable at all, you must plug that. Now, if the casing is viable, you can cap it. You can put a cap on it that can hold 400 PSI, and that's fine.
And the reason, and for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, the reason why it is so crucially important that these wells be identified and capped or plugged is because you can have somebody fall into it, which I think recently happened, and a grandfather saved a 4-year-old girl just a few weeks ago. I mean, that literally can happen. Animals can fall down into it, which means that you've got that dead rat syndrome at the bottom of your cistern. That's happening in your aquifer then. That's a direct conduit down into the aquifer, and you are harming the quality. So the reason you wanted it is a public safety hazard, right? And so that's the reason why you want to do it. And even if it looks visually okay, the casing on the inside might be crumbling, which means you might even have commingling of bad quality water with your fresh water. So on all levels, get with your district. They've got the resources to help you address that appropriately. Any other questions? All right, let us thank our panelists for this excellent presentation.